You woke up the morning after with $1 million in your account, and instead of feeling the euphoria you had imagined your entire life, you felt the strange and heavy silence that nobody ever prepared you to face. What nobody tells you about crossing that line is that fear doesn't disappear with the number on the screen. It simply changes its shape and starts pressing down on your shoulders in a completely different way. Because before the first million, you were afraid of never getting there. And after you arrive, the fear becomes something else. The fear of losing everything you spent years building with blood, discipline, and sacrifice. There is a collective fantasy in the United States about what it means to be a millionaire. An image constructed by movies, social media, and edited success stories that never show you what the morning after looks like. That fantasy promises absolute freedom, endless travel, zero financial worries, and the permanent feeling of having won. But the practical reality is far more complex, far more demanding, and far lonelier than any popular narrative has ever been willing to admit. What I want to show you in this video is not abstract financial theory, but what actually happens to the mindset, the priorities, and the decisions of someone who crosses that mark and has to figure out what to do with it. Before the first million, the financial game has a relatively simple logic. You work, you save a portion, you invest consistently, and you repeat the cycle until your net worth grows. But the moment you cross that line, the logic of the game changes its name entirely, because now the objective is no longer to accumulate. It becomes to preserve and multiply without destroying what was already built with so much effort. That transition seems obvious when you read it like this, but in practice, it does not happen automatically. And most people fail exactly at this turning point because nobody ever teaches you how to make that shift in mindset. The first instinct of someone who reaches the million is almost always the same. Upgrade your lifestyle quickly. Because after all, you worked hard for this and you feel like you deserve to enjoy the fruits of what you built. A better car, a bigger apartment, more upscale restaurants, more frequent travel, and all of it seems not only reasonable but completely justified after years of discipline and sacrifice. The problem is that there is a phenomenon called lifestyle inflation, and it destroys fortunes silently and gradually. Because when your expenses rise at the same pace as your net worth, you become rich on paper and cash flow poor in real life. I know stories of people who reached their first million and 2 years later were back to zero, not because of bad luck or an economic crisis, but because of spending decisions that seemed absolutely reasonable at the moment they were made. And the cruelest part of those stories is not the fall itself, but the fact that each individual decision seemed sensible, seemed deserved, seemed proportional to what they had achieved, while the combination of all of them was silently dismantling the foundation. So the first thing that needs to be crystal clear is that $1 million is not the same as financial freedom. And confusing those two concepts is the most expensive mistake you can make right after crossing that mark. True financial freedom is when your assets generate enough income to cover your entire life without you needing to trade time for money. And $1 million, depending on where you live in the United States, can be very far from that reality. Using a conservative allocation consistent with what financial experts recommend, $1 million well invested can generate somewhere between $3,000 and $4,000 per month in passive income, which in cities like New York, San Francisco, or Miami barely covers rent on a decent apartment. That is the paradox nobody wants to discuss openly. You can be a millionaire on paper and still be completely dependent on your job to pay this month's bills, which means the number changed, but the financial vulnerability did not. So what actually changes when you cross that line? The first genuine shift is not in the bank account, but in the kind of conversation you start having internally about money and about time. Before the million, the central question was, how do I make more money? How do I increase my income? How do I accelerate the accumulation? And all of your mental energy was pointed in that direction. After the million, the question that takes over your mind is completely different. How do I make this money work harder than I do? How do I build systems that generate value while I sleep? How do I stop being the only asset that matters? That shift seems subtle when you read it, but it completely redefines your relationship with time. Because when you have real wealth, every hour you spend trading time for money becomes a conscious choice, not a survival obligation. And that is exactly where the transition from employee to strategic investor needs to happen, not necessarily quitting your job tomorrow, but fundamentally changing how you think about the role your work plays in your financial equation. The second real change after the first million is your relationship with risk. Because before that, Mark, the biggest risk was not having enough money. But after it, the biggest risk becomes making the wrong decision with what you already built. A bad allocation driven by greed, an emotional investment disguised as strategy, misplaced trust in the wrong person. All of it can erase years of work far faster than it took to build them. That is why millionaires develop almost an obsession with asset protection and what once seemed like unnecessary bureaucracy. Things like legal structure, careful diversification, and tax planning suddenly becomes treated as an absolute priority. In the United States, the tax structure on capital gains is completely different from the structure on active income. And anyone who does not understand that difference in practice is literally paying more tax than the law requires. Month after month, LLCs, trusts, tax-advantaged accounts like strategic IRAs and 4 under 1 kiloseconds, and holding structures are not tools exclusive to the ultra-wealthy. They are legal and accessible instruments for anyone with assets who decides to learn how to use them. The third change is psychological, and it is perhaps the most underestimated of all, because money does not remove anxiety from your life. It simply replaces the old anxiety with a different version, more sophisticated and equally uncomfortable. Before, the anxiety was about not having enough, about paying the bills, about surviving. And that form of pressure, as painful as it is at least understandable and shared by almost everyone around you. After the anxiety shifts to losing what you have, to making the wrong call, to being taken advantage of by people who see you as an opportunity. And that version of pressure is lonelier because fewer people around you can actually understand it. There is a quiet isolation that follows real wealth accumulation. And it is not paranoia. It is a rational response to an environment where the social dynamics around someone with money genuinely change. You start questioning intentions, noticing subtle shifts in how people speak to you, feeling the weight of expectations that were never said out loud but are completely present in every interaction. And the fourth change, the one that hurts the most because nobody wants to admit it, is in your social circle, because when your mindset truly evolves, when your conversations shift in depth and your goals become different, some relationships simply do not survive. It is nobody's fault. It is not arrogance. It is not intentional distance. It is simply the natural result of real financial growth, requiring real personal growth, and not everyone around you is ready or willing to make that journey with you. The fifth change is the most strategic and most transformative of all. Your life focus shifts from active income to passive income. And that transition changes how you look at practically every decision you make. Active income is what you earn by doing. It is limited by the number of hours available and has a natural ceiling that no amount of dedication can break through. While passive income is what your assets generate while you simply exist. The millionaire who understands that difference on a visceral level starts building multiple income streams that do not require their constant presence, dividends, real estate, business equity, funds, and other structures that work while they sleep. And the ultimate goal is not to sit idle watching money come in, but to never again depend on a single income source to survive. Because dependence on one source, no matter how solid it appears, is structural vulnerability disguised as stability. Now I need to talk about the most common mistake I see happen after the first million. And it is more subtle and more dangerous than any bad allocation or misguided financial decision. It is the mistake of stagnation. The person reaches the goal they defined years earlier, takes a deep breath with a sense of mission accomplished, and without realizing it, completely loses the sense of urgency that brought them there. The ambition that served as fuel for all those years simply vanishes, because the emotional trigger that fed it has been satisfied, and the net worth stops growing, or worse, begins quietly shrinking while inflation and the cost of living keep advancing without pause. The first million needs to be treated as an inflection point in your journey, not as a final destination, as the first step on a longer and more interesting staircase, not as the maximum reward for years of effort. Because the difference between the millionaire who preserves, multiplies, and builds something meaningful, and the millionaire who stagnates and regresses is not luck, not the market, not external circumstances. It is exclusively the mindset they choose to carry after the milestone. If you are still on the path to get there, use this knowledge as a real competitive advantage. Prepare your mindset before you reach the number, because those who arrive prepared make completely different decisions than those who arrive caught off guard. If you have already crossed that line, assess honestly and without filters where you stand right now. Is your wealth truly working for you in a strategic way? Or are you still working for it to grow without structure, without protection, and without clear direction? That is the question that separates those who reach the first million from those who build something far beyond it. And the answer is not in the financial markets, not in the economy, not in luck. It lives entirely within you. Tell me in the comments, What hit you hardest in this video? Whether you were before or after the first million, and which part of this story made you think differently about your own financial path. Subscribe to the channel because there is a lot more content like this coming, and drop a like right now because it helps this video reach more people who need to hear this. Truth before making mistakes that cost years of their lives.